March 9th, 1945. Tokyo, Japan. The clock ticks toward midnight. A relentless, high-altitude wind sweeps across the Kanto Plain, carrying the biting cold of the Pacific night. Below, the sprawling, fragile capital of the Japanese Empire sleeps uneasily. Its heart is built of wood and paper, a dense landscape of vulnerability, illuminated only by the faint amber glow of blackout regulations. High above the coastline, the low, steady drone begins. It is the sound of distant, approaching thunder, mechanical and deep. It is the sound of the B-29 Superfortress. Tonight, there is no high-altitude precision. Tonight, the heavy bombers are flying low, stripped of their defensive armor, trading altitude for payload. They carry not conventional high explosive, but a catastrophic new rain of jellied gasoline and magnesium. A lone B-29 Pathfinder drops its first cluster of bombs onto the ancient city district of Shitamachi. The bombs burst open, scattering liquid fire. Within moments, small, localized flames begin to knit together, pushed by the furious ground wind. Below, ordinary citizens wake to the smell of smoke, the sound of crackling timber, and the impossible realization that the sky itself is falling, not as shrapnel or blast, but as an overwhelming, total inferno. This night would not be defined by bombs, but by fire. The sheer scale of the coming conflagration demanded a change in strategy, born of months of frustration and failure. The war in the Pacific had raged for over 3 years by the beginning of 1945, but the American strategy to bring the Japanese home islands to their knees through aerial bombardment was failing. The key instrument of this strategy was the B-29 Superfortress, a technological marvel designed specifically for the vast distances of the Pacific theater. It was America's greatest investment in long-range strategic warfare. Initial raids against Japan were launched from remote bases in China, targeting industrial complexes and aircraft factories. However, these Operation Matterhorn missions proved logistically unsustainable, plagued by supply line issues over the formidable Himalayan hump. The critical shift came with the capture of the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in mid-1944. These islands provided permanent, forward operating bases, shortening the round-trip flight to Tokyo to around 3,000 miles, a distance perfectly suited for the B-29. Under the command of General Haywood S. Hansel Jr., the newly established XXI Bomber Command began its systematic campaign of precision bombing. The doctrine, honed over Europe against German targets, demanded high-altitude daytime attacks using Norden bomb sites to destroy key Japanese infrastructure, specifically aircraft engine plants and refineries. But the doctrine met a wall of unforeseen challenges over Japan. The jet stream, a powerful band of high-altitude winds, was far stronger and more erratic over the Pacific than anticipated. At the necessary bombing altitude of 30,000 feet, the B-29s were battered by winds reaching 100 to 200 miles per hour, destroying the accuracy of the bomb sites. A bomb dropped high over Tokyo might drift miles off target before hitting the ground. Furthermore, the high altitude meant extreme cold and mechanical failure became routine hazards. The pressurized cabins often malfunctioned, and the crews suffered from debilitating fatigue. When the bombs did fall, they often missed the intended factory floors entirely, scattering across surrounding neighborhoods. The expected military return was critically low. By early 1945, after months of expensive, high-risk missions, the campaign was yielding negligible industrial damage. The cost in fuel, maintenance, and lost aircraft was unsustainable. Hansel insisted on sticking to the precision model, believing the breakthrough was imminent, but the political and military leadership in Washington demanded results. The high-altitude campaign was not breaking the Japanese war economy. It was merely scratching the surface of their massive, decentralized industrial base. The Japanese war machine, unlike Germany's, relied on thousands of small, interconnected workshops often housed within residential areas, feeding parts to larger assembly plants. Targeting one factory did not halt production. It merely shifted it to a dozen others. The American command needed a new weapon, a new altitude, and a new man to unlock the destructive potential of the B-29. This man arrived in January 1945, carrying a mandate for utter devastation. The pressure reached its breaking point in January 1945. General Hansel was relieved of command and replaced by Major General Curtis E. LeMay. LeMay was known throughout the U.S. Army Air Forces for his blunt, uncompromising demeanor and an unwavering focus on mission effectiveness above all else. His famous command philosophy was simple. If the current approach wasn't working, adopt a more ruthless one. LeMay's initial analysis of the XXI Bomber Command's performance confirmed his suspicion. The technological challenges and the nature of the Japanese target base made high-altitude, precision bombing an exercise in futility. He recognized the fundamental vulnerability of Japan that Hansel had overlooked: its massive, densely packed, wood-and-paper cities. Over 70% of Japan's urban structures were highly flammable, and much of the manufacturing that supported the war effort was distributed among these residential areas. The solution was a radical tactical overhaul. LeMay determined that the objective should shift from surgical strikes against specific machinery to the systemic destruction of the entire urban infrastructure supporting the war effort. The new weapon of choice would be the incendiary bomb, specifically the M69 cluster. This device contained 38 individual fire units, each filled with napalm, jelly gasoline. When dropped, the cluster would open, scattering the small firebombs across a wide area. The crucial change was the attack profile. LeMay ordered the B-29s to drop down from 30,000 feet to altitudes between 5,000 and 8,000 feet. This was a desperate gamble. At this low altitude, the jet stream was negligible, accuracy was restored, and the payload could be dramatically increased. However, this also placed the massive, slow-moving bombers squarely within the range of Japanese light anti-aircraft guns and night fighters, which they had previously avoided. To maximize the incendiary payload and increase speed, LeMay gave a controversial order: strip the B-29s of their defensive armor and all ammunition for their machine guns, except for the tail turret. This reduced the aircraft's weight by thousands of pounds, allowing them to carry thousands more pounds of firebombs. It was a terrifying proposition for the flight crews, trading their personal safety for destructive efficiency. LeMay himself later famously summarized the moral calculus of his decision: if we lose, we'll be tried as war criminals. But the calculation was that the rapid, massive destruction of Japanese cities would hasten the end of the war, ultimately saving more American, and perhaps even Japanese, lives than a protracted campaign of attrition. The groundwork was laid for a new kind of total aerial warfare, one where the distinction between factory and home would vanish in the ensuing firestorm. The target selected for the strategic testing of this new doctrine was the most vulnerable, yet most vital, part of the Japanese Empire: the industrial sprawl of eastern Tokyo. The cornerstone of LeMay's new campaign was not the B-29 itself, but its payload, the M69 incendiary bomb. Developed by the U.S. Chemical Warfare Service, the M69 represented a highly refined delivery system for napalm. Each munition was roughly 3 feet long and weighed just over 6 pounds. Crucially, they were packed into a cylindrical container called an M19 cluster adapter, which could hold 38 of the small bombs. When dropped from the aircraft, the M19 cluster was stabilized by a tail fin. At a preset altitude, a small explosive charge inside the adapter scattered the 38 M69 units widely. Each M69 was designed to strike a surface, ideally punching through the light roof of a Japanese home, before its internal fuse ignited a small black powder charge. This charge ejected the contents, a thickened, gelatinous form of gasoline, spreading the burning compound over a wide, irregular area. The substance, known as napalm, adhered to surfaces and burned at temperatures reaching 1,000 $C. The effect was not a single explosion, but a rapid proliferation of dozens of intense, localized fires. Against the dry, densely packed wooden structures of Tokyo, the M69 was not just a fire starter. It was a fire accelerator engineered to rapidly create the conditions for a city-killing firestorm. The technology transformed the B-29 from a high-altitude machine destroyer into a low-level fire delivery truck. For the B-29 air crews, LeMay's orders introduced a new level of terror. They were veteran flyers, accustomed to the relative safety of 30,000 feet, where Japanese defenses were largely ineffective. Now, they were ordered to descend into the most vulnerable combat zone, below 10,000 feet, where searchlights could easily find them and ground-based anti-aircraft fire, flak, was most deadly. Their only protection had been stripped away. The crews had watched as ground crews removed the heavy armor plating and most of the aircraft's defensive .50 caliber machine guns. Only the gunner in the rear tail turret retained his weapons, primarily to fend off any rare pursuit by Japanese night fighters. The rationale was simple. The removal of weight allowed the plane to carry an additional ton of firebombs and made the bomber marginally faster, reducing the time spent in the anti-aircraft kill zone. Pilots were told that their speed and the confusion caused by the initial wave of fires would provide sufficient protection. For the 300-plus crews who flew the first major fire raid, this was a moment of profound psychological tension. They were flying a defenseless, slow giant of a machine, low over a hostile city, carrying the incendiary equivalent of 1,000 gasoline barrels. Their mission relied entirely on the shock and speed of the attack, and the hope that the fires would quickly overwhelm the Japanese defenses. The Japanese air defense system, under the command of the Eastern District Army, was engineered to counter the precision raids it had been facing. Its defenses consisted primarily of high-altitude night fighters, designed to operate in the stratosphere, and heavy anti-aircraft batteries positioned near key industrial targets. When the first wave of low-flying B-29s approached on the night of March 9th, the Japanese military was utterly confused. Their radar and spotters initially registered the approaching force, but the bombers were at an altitude where they were never expected to be. The night fighters, positioned far higher, struggled to rapidly descend and engage the enemy, and many were rendered useless by the sudden tactical shift. More terrifying for the defending Japanese pilots was the immediate, apocalyptic result of the bombing. Within minutes, the first fires merged into massive columns of smoke and thermal updrafts. Japanese fighter pilots who managed to scramble found themselves flying into a self-created hell. The smoke was impenetrable, rising to nearly 20,000 feet, making navigation impossible and leading to mid-air disorientation. The intense turbulence generated by the rapidly heating air was violent, throwing aircraft out of control. Many Japanese pilots were quite literally terrified of entering the firestorm they were meant to defend. The failure to adjust to the low altitude, high incendiary attack meant the skies over Tokyo were opened, allowing the bulk of the attacking force to deliver their catastrophic payload virtually unopposed. For the ordinary citizens of Tokyo, life by early 1945 was a grim exercise in endurance. Food was rationed, resources were scarce, and the constant threat of aerial attack was a psychological burden. They lived under a system of mandatory blackouts, enforced with strict discipline, turning the sprawling metropolis into a labyrinth of shadows at night. The Japanese government, anticipating the shift to bombing highly flammable residential areas, had initiated rudimentary fire defense measures. Civilians were organized into neighborhood firefighting groups, armed with buckets, small hand pumps, and rudimentary tools. They were instructed to fight individual fires, creating fire breaks by tearing down surrounding structures. This strategy was based on localized, small-scale control, utterly inadequate for the mass attacks that LeMay was planning. Furthermore, Japanese industry had become deeply embedded within the residential fabric. Small workshops, often family-run, produced vital components for aircraft, munitions, and uniforms right next to their homes. This decentralized production system, which was meant to make the industry resilient to conventional bombing, paradoxically made the civilian population a central target of the new incendiary doctrine. The population had no choice but to live and work in the crosshairs. When the fires began, evacuation routes were non-existent, and the narrow, winding streets quickly became choked with panicked crowds, making any organized defense impossible. For the ordinary citizens of Tokyo, life by early 1945 was a grim exercise in endurance. Food was rationed, resources were scarce, and the constant threat of aerial attack was a psychological burden. They lived under a system of mandatory blackouts, enforced with strict discipline, turning the sprawling metropolis into a labyrinth of shadows at night. The Japanese government, anticipating the shift to bombing highly flammable residential areas, had initiated rudimentary fire defense measures. Civilians were organized into neighborhood firefighting groups, armed with buckets, small hand pumps, and rudimentary tools. They were instructed to fight individual fires, creating fire breaks by tearing down surrounding structures. This strategy was based on localized, small-scale control, utterly inadequate for the mass attacks that LeMay was planning. Furthermore, Japanese industry had become deeply embedded within the residential fabric. Small workshops, often family-run, produced vital components for aircraft, munitions, and uniforms right next to their homes. This decentralized production system, which was meant to make the industry resilient to conventional bombing, paradoxically made the civilian population a central target of the new incendiary doctrine. The population had no choice but to live and work in the crosshairs. When the fires began, evacuation routes were non-existent, and the narrow, winding streets quickly became choked with panicked crowds, making any organized defense impossible. The decision to execute the firebombing campaign rested squarely on the shoulders of General Curtis LeMay. His leadership angle was one of cold, brutal pragmatism, driven by the singular goal of ending the war as quickly as possible. He understood that the massive loss of life this strategy entailed was morally difficult, but he justified it by an overriding belief in its ultimate efficacy. LeMay was explicit about the strategic objective: to destroy Japan's will to fight by demonstrating the utter hopelessness of their position. He theorized that the cumulative psychological effect of losing entire cities, the collapse of civil morale, and the destruction of the small-scale infrastructure would achieve what precision bombing had failed to do. He viewed the attacks as a necessary evil, a high-cost shortcut to avoid a far more devastating full-scale invasion of the Japanese mainland, Operation Downfall, which was projected to cost hundreds of thousands of Allied lives. He chose the night of March 9th to 10th specifically because the prevailing seasonal wind conditions promised to be high and dry, ideal for propagating a massive conflagration. This was calculated terror, a weaponization of meteorology and urban sociology. LeMay authorized the use of over 1,600 tons of M69s on Tokyo, a force designed to create not just many fires, but a genuine firestorm, a meteorological phenomenon where the heat of the fires becomes so intense that it sucks in oxygen from the periphery, creating hurricane-force winds and incinerating everything in its path. His order was clear: minimum altitude, maximum payload, and total destruction of the target area. The firebombing of Tokyo fundamentally redefined the moral boundary of aerial warfare in the Pacific. While the bombing of cities was not new, the Blitz, Dresden, and Hamburg had already occurred. The Tokyo raid represented an unprecedented, calculated targeting of a non-combatant population center designed specifically for annihilation by fire. The rationale used was the concept of total war, where the entire productive capacity of the enemy nation, including its civilian labor force and housing, became a legitimate military target. The American command argued that since the Japanese citizens were actively engaged in war production and the industry was indistinguishable from the residential areas, no moral distinction could be made. Chart comparing casualty rates and destruction area of Tokyo versus other major urban bombings. However, the sheer speed and efficiency of the destruction on March 9th to 10th went beyond merely crippling industry. It became an act of mass extermination. The deliberate choice of incendiaries over conventional explosives, coupled with the low-altitude delivery, signaled a shift from targeting military capacity to targeting human infrastructure, crossing an ethical line that would later be hotly debated and forever anchor the legacy of the U.S. strategic bombing campaign against Japan. The stage was now set for the execution of LeMay's plan, where all these factors, the new technology, the terrifying low flight, the vulnerable city, and the grim moral decision, would converge on one horrifying night. The night of March 9th, 1945, was clear and dangerously dry. The air was cold, promising a perfect environment for the propagation of fire. Shortly after the clock crossed 10:30 p.m., the first of 334 B-29 Superfortresses from the XXI Bomber Command began to cross the coastline, dropping in altitude to their designated bombing levels, ranging between 5,000 and 8,000 feet. The target was a designated 6-by-3-mile zone in the Shitamachi district of Tokyo, a highly congested area of mixed residential and light industry. The first aircraft were the Pathfinders, tasked with outlining the target zone with high-intensity fire markers. They dropped their M69 clusters, which immediately erupted into fierce, localized fires. The Japanese air defense, caught completely off guard by the low-level approach, struggled to react. The anti-aircraft fire was sporadic and uncoordinated, its shells often bursting harmlessly above the descending formation. At 12:15 a.m., the main force began its destructive run. The B-29s, flying in a continuous, terrifying stream for the next 3 hours, discharged their 1,665 tons of incendiary payload. The tactical plan was simple: drop the bombs in a tight pattern, allow the individual fires to merge, and rely on the dry wooden city itself to fuel the conflagration. Diagram illustrating the low-altitude bombing run and target area of the Shitamachi district. As the initial wave passed, the individual points of fire coalesced with nightmarish speed. The high wind that LeMay had banked on, a brisk 15 to 25 miles per hour, began to feed the flames. The heat intensity multiplied exponentially as structures touched fire, vaporizing the moisture in the adjacent structures, preparing them for immediate combustion. Below the bombers, the chaos on the ground was immediate and total. Civilian firefighting efforts were overwhelmed in minutes. The small water pumps and buckets were useless against the tidal wave of heat and flame. The narrow streets, which had been intended as fire breaks, now acted as flue pipes, channeling the wind and heat, accelerating the inferno, and turning escape routes into tunnels of fire. The pilots in the second and third waves of B-29s were met with a sight that defied all previous experience of aerial warfare. They were flying into a colossal pillar of fire and smoke that rose tens of thousands of feet into the night sky, illuminated from within by the raging city below. The sheer heat was so intense that some crews reported the smell of burning flesh and materials inside their pressurized cabins, despite being thousands of feet above the ground. The B-29s themselves were buffeted by severe thermal updrafts, violent currents of superheated air that tossed the massive aircraft around like toys. The attack had successfully moved beyond strategic damage. It had created a self-sustaining, meteorological weapon, a perfect firestorm. As the B-29 fleet continued their low-altitude runs, the firestorm achieved its terrifying peak intensity between 1:30 a.m. and 3 a.m. on March 10th. This was not a collection of burning neighborhoods, but a single, vast hyperconflagration. The core temperature of the fire rose high enough to melt glass and twist steel. The central mechanism of the firestorm was the creation of a massive low-pressure zone at its heart. The superheated air over the burning district rose rapidly, pulling in massive quantities of cooler, oxygen-rich air from all sides. This created cyclonic, gale-force winds on the periphery, reported to be over $50 miles per hour. These winds violently tore roofs off houses, scattered embers for miles, and fed an insatiable hunger for fuel. On the ground, these wind tunnels sealed the fate of thousands trapped within the target zone. Fleeing crowds were caught in the intense rush of air, sometimes being driven back into the flames. Rivers and canals, the last hope for shelter, were turned into deadly zones. The immense heat generated steam from the water, and the air immediately above the surface was rendered unbreathable, filled with carbon monoxide and smoke. Many civilians who plunged into the water to escape the heat ultimately drowned or suffocated. The devastation was geographically specific, yet total within the target area. The Shitamachi district, a dense, historical area of Tokyo near the Sumida River, was entirely consumed. Witnesses described walls of fire rushing down streets, moving faster than a human could run. The wooden homes combusted almost instantly, creating a thermal radiation so intense that people in the open spontaneously burst into flames. Above the hellish spectacle, the B-29 pilots, including Major Robert S. Pease, reported the experience of flying over a massive oil fire. The smell of burning rubber, wood, and flesh was distinct. One pilot described the scene as looking like a vat of boiling oil. The turbulence was so severe that some bombers experienced damage, and many crews fought to maintain control of their aircraft while simultaneously battling nausea and disorientation from the smoke and violent air currents. The tactical gamble paid off with catastrophic efficiency. Japanese air defenses were neutralized by the sheer scale of the environmental disaster. Those few remaining Japanese fighter pilots who bravely attempted to intercept the bombers were either lost in the smoke columns or driven away by the uncontrollable atmospheric conditions. The overwhelming majority of the 334 superfortresses completed their runs and safely exited the target zone. By dawn on March 10th, the B-29s were gone, leaving behind a 16-square-mile wasteland of ash and smoldering debris. The sky over Tokyo was black, not with the natural darkness of night, but with a lingering pall of dense, oily smoke. The turning point was complete. Strategic bombing had failed, but total fire warfare had succeeded, demonstrating a new, horrifying destructive capacity. When the sun finally struggled to penetrate the immense smoke cloud hanging over Tokyo on the morning of March 10th, 1945, the full horror of the single, largest destructive air raid in human history became visible. The scale of the catastrophe defied immediate comprehension. The area of devastation spanned 15.8 square miles of the most densely populated, working-class districts of Tokyo. This was a greater area of destruction than had been inflicted on any single German city during the entire European Air War. The fire had burned so hot and so completely that in many areas there was little left but carbonized soil and heaps of melted metal. Over 267,000 buildings were entirely destroyed, representing nearly a quarter of all residential structures in the capital. The immediate human cost was staggering. Official Japanese records, which were likely conservative, tallied over 83,793 confirmed deaths and more than 40,000 injuries. However, subsequent analyses by U.S. historians and Japanese agencies often placed the fatality count closer to 100,000 to 125,000 people, killed in approximately 6 hours. More people died in the Tokyo raid than in the initial bombings of Hiroshima or Nagasaki. This number represented the greatest loss of life from a single conventional bombing attack in history. The Japanese military and civil defense systems were paralyzed. The rapid loss of communications, the destruction of firefighting equipment, and the sheer volume of casualties overwhelmed every available resource. Emergency services could not navigate the miles of blocked and burning streets. The immediate response centered on recovering bodies, a gruesome task often conducted by survivors and uninjured troops who faced the dual threat of latent fires and the oppressive stench of the disaster. Beyond the human toll, the economic impact was severe, though difficult to measure precisely. The decentralized nature of Japanese war production meant that while major factories were spared, thousands of tiny workshops vital for subcomponent manufacturing were incinerated. Estimates suggested a significant disruption, particularly in optics, small armaments, and aircraft parts, though the exact percentage was contested. The more profound wound was psychological. The capital had been targeted and annihilated, proving that the imperial government could not protect its own people. The shock resonated immediately through the Japanese high command. For months, they had dismissed the B-29 raids as inaccurate and ineffectual. The events of March 10th proved that the American Air Forces had found a method of total destruction they could not counter. This realization forced a dramatic reassessment of the war's trajectory, leading directly to the conclusion that the home islands themselves were indefensible against this new form of aerial terror. The success of the Tokyo raid on March 9th to 10th was instantly recognized by General Curtis LeMay and the American command as the decisive turning point in the air campaign. The results validated LeMay's ruthless gamble. Low altitude, area bombing using incendiaries was overwhelmingly effective against the unique urban geography of Japan. This single night provided the blueprint for the annihilation of nearly every remaining major Japanese city. The strategic shift was immediate and brutal. Over the next 10 days, the XXI Bomber Command systematically targeted 3 other major industrial centers using the exact same low-altitude, incendiary tactics: Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe. The raids were devastatingly successful, confirming that the initial Tokyo attack was not a fluke, but the new, horrifying reality of the war. By the end of March 1945, LeMay's command had destroyed over 32 square miles of urban area in Japan, delivering a mortal blow to the supporting infrastructure of the Japanese war effort. The military implications were clear to the U.S. planners. Mass firebombing proved that the Japanese homeland could not withstand the full power of the B-29 fleet. This efficacy strongly influenced the high-level planning for the eventual invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall. While LeMay continued the firebombing to force a surrender, the massive damage and calculated terror served as a grim alternative to a land invasion, which was still projected to cost millions of lives. On the Japanese side, the psychological and political trauma was profound. The scale of the death toll and destruction shattered the carefully cultivated myth of the home, islands, and vulnerability. The attacks exposed the complete failure of the government to protect its citizens. This widespread realization led to a deepening despair and a massive internal migration as hundreds of thousands of people fled the major cities, attempting to find safety in the rural areas. This exodus further crippled urban industrial output and strained the remaining national resources. The survivors of the firestorm were left with indelible images of apocalyptic chaos. Rivers choked with bodies, entire neighborhoods vanished into ash, and the pervasive, sickening smell of burnt life. The memory of the night of the black snow became a national wound. Quote from Japanese survivor, describing the firestorm and the heat. Ultimately, the Tokyo fire raid of March 1945 did not force an immediate surrender, but it achieved what months of precision bombing could not. It physically and psychologically prepared the Japanese nation for total capitulation. It demonstrated that the Americans possessed the will and the means to destroy the Japanese civilization piece by piece. This campaign of utter destruction accelerated the timeline toward the end of the war and established a grim precedent for the escalation of total warfare that would soon find its ultimate expression in atomic weaponry. The firebombing of Tokyo on March 9th to 10th, 1945, remains a devastating landmark in the history of modern warfare. It stands not merely as a decisive military victory for the Allied forces, but as a profound and chilling example of the strategic escalation of total war. It was the night the moral distinction between the military target and the civilian population finally collapsed under the intense heat of a manufactured firestorm. The technological ingenuity of the M69 incendiary and the raw logistical power of the B-29 fleet merged with a ruthless tactical doctrine crafted by General LeMay. This combination demonstrated that industrial might could be translated directly into environmental destruction on a massive, unprecedented scale. The raid proved that the sheer vulnerability of a nation's social and housing infrastructure could be weaponized just as effectively as its factories and armies. The legacy of the Tokyo raid is complex and enduring. For the United States, it confirmed that the use of overwhelming destructive force against the home front was a viable, if morally costly, means of compelling an enemy surrender, potentially saving American lives that would have been lost in an invasion. It underscored the emerging principle of deterrence through destruction. For Japan, the memory of that night became an anchor point of profound national tragedy. The loss of life was colossal, and the method of death, incineration by fire driven by hurricane-force winds, etched a unique trauma into the collective consciousness. It showed the Japanese people that the war was no longer fought in distant theaters, but in the heart of their homes. Ultimately, the firebombing campaign, which continued throughout the spring and summer of 1945, served as the massive conventional precursor to the atomic age. It established the acceptance of citywide destruction as a valid military objective. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki just 5 months later, their horror was instantly recognizable, not as an entirely new concept of destruction, but as a more efficient, consolidated version of the total annihilation first perfected over the wooden heart of Tokyo. The terror that gripped Japanese pilots that night, watching their city dissolve into flame, was the terror of a new age, where the war could no longer be contained by lines on a map or walls of steel.